Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about serotonin deficits. They don't cause depression. Is this revelation or is this fake news? So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can write them down and I'll get to them at the end, and you can post questions here later as well. So I usually start with the takeaway. The takeaway is a recent meta-analysis recently came to the conclusion that serotonin found very little evidence that deficits in serotonin activity or deficits in serotonin amounts were a cause of depression. And my conclusion is that's a valuable message to be putting out there, but that most of the extrapolations, conclusions, and claims that flowed from that were overstated and or ridiculous and or false. So jumping over to what the actual study showed. So Joanna Moncrieff, who's a psychiatrist at University College London, and her colleagues performed a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So this is no new data was created. No new studies or research were done. This was looking at, initially, they sorted through 843 different studies, and out of that only chose to examine 17 of those that met their criteria. And these were all meta-analyses that they were evaluating to see whether we have support for the theory that a deficit in serotonin causes depression. And they looked in 6 different areas for areas of research into the studies. So area number 1 was whether the studies looking at whether lower levels of serotonin or lower levels of serotonin's immediate metabolite, which is more stable and easier to assay in blood and other fluids, 5-HIAA, 5-hydroxyindolacetic acid, whether either serotonin or 5-HIAA levels were lower in people who were depressed. Second area they were looking at studies in were looking at whether there are changes in serotonin receptors levels that we can find, which we would anticipate if a deficit in serotonin was causing depression. And specifically, they looked at, even though we have more than a dozen identified types of serotonin receptors, they were looking at the 5-1A serotonin receptor, which has been implicated in depression and anxiety and is first identified as an autoreceptor on the nerve cell that is releasing serotonin. So it's involved in regulating serotonin levels. Number 3 realm that they looked at is whether, separate from the receptors that serotonin binds to, there's also another very important molecule called SERT, or the serotonin transporter molecule. That's actually what the serotonin reuptake inhibitors bind to. So after serotonin is released from a nerve cell, floats into the synaptic cleft and acts on the downstream neuron, normally by osmosis and binding to this receptor, the SERT protein, serotonin is pulled back into the cell that just released it, which helps and terminate the signal that's been delivered, and blocking that transporter, which is what the serotonin reuptake inhibitors do, allows that same amount of serotonin to act for a much longer time on the downstream neurons. So can we see changes in amounts of the serotonin transporter molecule in people with depression? Number 4 is whether depletion of serotonin in the brain through tryptophan depleting diets or solutions causes depression. So 5-HAA is the metabolite, the breakdown product of serotonin. Tryptophan is the amino acid that in 2 different steps, first to 5-hydroxytryptophan and then 5-hydroxytryptamine, which is serotonin's other name, is the precursor of serotonin. So presumably, if serotonin deficits cause depression, then blocking the pathway for making serotonin would induce depression. Point number 5, that they were looking for studies which investigated whether higher levels of the gene that makes the serotonin transporter are implicated or associated with people who have depression. So presumably, again, looking at the point number 3, I think, if you have higher levels of the transporter, where would that come from? That could come from genes that are more active or more copies of it producing that more. And point 6 that they were looking for was whether there's an interaction between the SERT gene and stress. And this is based on a study that garnered lots of attention a few years back, which there are different forms of the serotonin transporter gene, and one form of that was associated in people who had stressful life events with later depression. So they didn't find overall one form or the other predicting depression itself, but this initial study found that one form of the serotonin transporter gene in association with a stressful early childhood resulted in higher likelihood of depression. So they looked at all these studies, and their conclusions were that for all 6 points, the data was either non-existent for supporting the role, or if it was there, it was pretty weak and muddied. And from that, I'm going to try to quote it directly. They said, "There's no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity." That in itself is, I'd say, one reasonable interpretation of evidence. It's not the only one. I'm going to go, so before I go through and sort of bring up critiques and major flaws with this meta-analysis, I'm going to go on to why it's worth, as it were, attacking or analyzing or assessing it. And part of it is that Moncrieff and some of her associates have gone on to much more widely make claims. So one of the other, in her writing, she says, because of this lack of evidence for the serotonin depletion theory, that means we have little evidence supporting a medical deficit, something wrong in the brain is causing depression. And quote, "Therefore, we have to conclude that what antidepressants are doing are changing normal chemistry." I don't think that's a conclusion we have to come through. So she further claims or states in different versions that depression, rather than being a result of biochemistry in the brain, depression is, quote, "a reaction to things going wrong in life," end of quote. And furthermore, strongly intimates that what antidepressants are doing is mostly a placebo effect or emotional numbing, and that we should be using many fewer doses of antidepressants and using much more psychotherapy. So jumping into the analysis of the meta-analyses. So point number 1, and she concedes this in the actual article, is that the point number 1 was looking at lower levels of serotonin or serotonin or 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid and not finding much in people who are depressed. Why that's not such a big deal is that almost all of these studies were looking at bodily fluids like blood, or mostly blood, sometimes urine, very little looking at the brain. We know that there's something like 98% of the serotonin in your body is coming from your digestive system. It's not up in your brain. So using blood levels of these molecule of serotonin or its metabolite isn't very meaningful in terms of telling us what's going on in the brain. Another point, so I'll jump into the second objection, is that a big objection to every single one of the 6 sets of studies or findings she looked at is that the critics, and I would strongly agree with them, that most of us think that depression is a heterogeneous, so it comes from a variety of different sources, contributions, causes. So everyone's depression is not identical or alike in terms of either how it presents or in terms of its origins. And if you're mixing a whole bunch of differently caused depressions together, you may well be swamping out and missing the signal of the people who really do have a serotonin deficit. So by analogy, if you look at blood pressure and stimulant medications, look at blood pressure and Adderall, study after study, big studies or meta-analyses of studies shows what she would call a small to negligible effect of blood pressure from Adderall. It's either statistically not different from the placebo groups, or at most it's 4 or 5 points. That's meaningless, according to her criteria. On the other hand, if you look at it more finely or break it into groups, if you look at Adderall, about 10% of people on Adderall show blood pressure increases of 15 points or more. So again, if you look at a big heterogeneous mixture and you don't find a signal, that doesn't tell you that that signal isn't present in the population or in a subset of the population. It just says it's being averaged out by everything. So that objection to her meta-analyses of meta-analyses is valid for all 6 of the points. Criticism of point number 2, that the receptor levels of the serotonin 1A receptor aren't different in depressive populations. Some of that's been critiqued on the fact that she's assuming that 1A is only an autoreceptor, when in fact it is both an autoreceptor and a downstream receptor. And it's not even completely clear what you would expect in terms of higher or lower levels if there were a serotonin deficit causing depression. And of the other points, I'd say probably number 4, looking at the tryptophan depletion, another meta-analysis published just about a year ago came to a very different conclusion. They concluded there was fairly substantial evidence. And part of it is if particularly you are looking at depressed individuals who are on serotonin reuptake inhibitors and give them tryptophan depleting diets, which presumably are lowering serotonin, there you more consistently find a recurrence of depression when that intervention is given. And interestingly, for people who are responding to a non-serotonin antidepressant, so a tricyclic antidepressant that affects norepinephrine, that same tryptophan deprivation, which should be lowering serotonin in those people as well, doesn't kick all of them back into depression. So again, there are specific critiques to different parts of this meta-analysis, but I would start over with sort of the whole question that it's examining. She chose to look at a very narrow interpretation of the serotonin hypothesis for causing for depression. And yes, I will concede that this is a misconception that many patients have. I agree that it's a misconception that drug companies have been very eager to promote, although even there, often they use weasel words to make it clear, if you're reading completely closely, that they are not stating outright as a fact that serotonin deficits cause depression. So often people come into my office saying, with the belief that, maybe they've been on medications for years, maybe with the belief either from pharmaceutical advertising or maybe from what previous psychiatrists have told them, that they are on a serotonin reuptake inhibitor because they have a deficit of serotonin, and this is fixing that, and that's why it works, and it makes sense to keep taking it. When I hear those stories in the office, for 25, so we know that story is false, and we've known it since the beginning of the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We've known it from day one, And I would argue that any thinking psychiatrist has never told patients that you have a serotonin deficit that's going to be fixed by this molecule. And why do I say that? I say that because look at what these drugs do. They're direct serotonin reuptake inhibitors, direct, immediate, within minutes to hours effect is to block that SERT transporter, to make more serotonin available to the downstream serotonin receiving neurons. So it produces an immediate, rapid boost in serotonin action on the downstream side. And yet, side effects can sometimes show up fairly quickly within hours, days, but invariably, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and so far most of our other class of antidepressants, take days, weeks, almost a month before they're fully effective. About half the people by 2 weeks in are seeing some effect, but it doesn't correlate with serotonin action. So again, we've known from the very beginning that this model, which she is attacking, and again, rightfully attacking, we've known that that's not an accurate model. So when patients are looking confused and say, well, what's going on and how do these work? What I tell people is, if I had a Nobel Prize, I would know how antidepressants are working. I don't have a Nobel Prize. Right now, nobody knows the exact mechanism of action. But does that mean we know nothing about it? No. I would argue that there is pretty compelling, substantial, repeated, replicated data that shows that whether it's messing with norepinephrine or with serotonin, or maybe even dopamine, that our conventional antidepressants and glutamate and other systems may well be involved too, but our mainstream antidepressants right now, that serotonin boost is serving as a signal, and the signal's telling the brain to do several things. It's telling the brain to gear up the assembly line to make new proteins, and why we know this is because chemicals that block protein synthesis block the action of antidepressants. So brain is making new proteins. It's not just making new proteins. It has to insert these proteins in cell membranes. And remember, neurons are some of our largest cells in the body. So it takes a long time for a protein that's been manufactured in the cell body to be transported all the way to the end of an axon or a dendrite. So that takes time. And it takes time for new cellular interneuron connections to be made. And probably part of the process is also making new brain cells. All those steps take time. All those steps are long-term indirect consequences of messing with serotonin. But that doesn't mean that because we can't see changes in serotonin levels or receptors or proteins for the genes coding for the serotonin transporter, that we know nothing about what's going on and we have no evidence that biochemistry is involved. So a few other overarching critiques of what she said. Again, not just that depression's heterogeneous, she takes a pretty distorted view of the biopsychosocial model. So my interpretation of the biopsychosocial model of psychiatry, medicine, both, is that simultaneously humans are biological entities, biochemical entities, neurostructural network entities. We are also psychological entities, and we are social animals that are interacting with our human and non-human built environment. All of those are true simultaneously. It's not that one's more important, it's not more. And that depression is a perturbation at all of those levels. So given that every thought, every feeling, every reaction has a biochemical correlate in your brain, that one I think is hard to argue with. Some might, but most don't. And if we are saying depression is an aberrant state, then there is an aberrant biochemistry, at least in that moment, whether or not we've identified it, whether or not we can replicate it, whether or not it's even the same person to person. So my strategy when I'm working with people is, if it's important to get people out of this state of depression, it makes sense to push on as many different levels of the organism as possible. So yes, trying to right social justice, trying to prevent discrimination against groups, trying to slow the effects of global warming, which are stressing lots of people. And you should be connecting people with resources that are, and making them aware of efforts that are combating those things. And you should be simultaneously working at the psychological level to look at internal conflicts, conflicts with friend groups, family groups, work groups, whatever may be causing stress. And if you can, you should be pushing at a biochemical level. So I don't think that believing that there is a biochemical attribute or aspect of depression means that we have to pay attention only to biochemistry, which is pretty much what she claims. Other claims that I would say just are nonsensical. So not knowing how the mechanism of action doesn't mean that something doesn't work. Most people who could drive a car these days don't know the mechanism of how their engine's working. And even an old-time mechanic who wasn't used to electrical computer-based systems may not know how your modern car is working. That doesn't mean the car isn't working. So again, not knowing a mechanism of action doesn't mean that something isn't working. And again, some of the claim that depression is a reaction to things going wrong in life is just so incredibly vapid to be meaningless. So what I'm getting at by that is, I think everyone has things that go wrong in their lives. And yet lots of people aren't becoming depressed. And on the other hand, lots of people who feel depressed say, I don't know why I'm depressed. My life is good. My job is good. I'm happy with my spouse. I'm just feeling depressed. So third, if she's strongly promoting psychotherapy is a better alternative to medications, or safer and or more effective, then she should go back and look at the data. And I would say that the data supporting psychotherapy is not any stronger, and in many cases is weaker, and it's been harder to document psychotherapy's benefits compared to medications. So that's about all I have to say regarding serotonin deficits as a cause for depression. Yes, I think it's great to be pointing out and correcting people's misperception, but I think if you're encouraging them to throw out the baby with the bathwater and not try antidepressants in situations that they're warranted, I'm not saying they're warranted for everyone. I think they are a valuable and useful and powerful part of our armamentarium for addressing depression. So next week's topic is going to be Journée, what makes it special. Have a good week. I'm not seeing any questions right now. Bye.